The first morning of the freeze started with a scream, not from outside, but from within the snow-caked walls of that strange hillside burrow they once mocked as a grave. The scream wasn't fear, but birth. A woman no one in the valley had spoken to in months, save for the grocer's boy, and maybe old Carpenter Smith, who only ever nodded in passing, was suddenly at the center of something brutal and silent and deeply human. That scream came from somewhere deep beneath the frozen earth, beneath layers of packed soil and braced timbers, hidden behind a door of snow and brush no outsider could see, not unless they were crawling on hands and knees through a narrow passage that shouldn't have existed. Her name was Lena Wilkes, widow for going on 2 years now, mother of 2 small boys, one just a toddler, the other barely old enough to help stack firewood, and now on that cruelest morning in January, she became a mother once more, her body trembling under the packed clay of her tunnel home, soaked in sweat while the land outside turned to stone beneath wind. No one heard her, no one knew, and no one came, because to the settlers scattered across the valley, Lena had long been written off as something between pitiful and lunatic, a woman who, rather than rebuild her husband's cabin, after it caught fire 2 winters back, had begun to dig, day after day, through the spring mud, the summer clay, and the autumn frost. She dug with her boys in tow, swinging a pickaxe with blistered hands, carving out what they called that fox den, or her grave in progress. Some said grief had broken her. Others thought it was pride. The preacher's wife once said Lena had whispered to her that she needed the earth to hold her when the cold came, that wood walls weren't enough. Whatever the reason, by the time the first blizzard rolled down from the northern pass, Lena had vanished from sight, sealed up beneath a snowy ridge like a badger in a burrow, with only a chimney-sized vent pipe sticking up like a marker stone. It wasn't a chimney, not in the normal sense, just a vertical shaft she'd carved by hand, capped with bundled straw and cloth, drawing air into her tunnel home from the ridge above. It vented steam and smoke sometimes, which caught the eye of the homesteaders in town, but even that had started to fade. By the time the freeze truly arrived, the kind that made cabin nails snap like twigs and froze livestock where they stood, no one remembered Lena, until a rider came pounding into town one dawn, coat frozen solid, horse white with frost, shouting about a smoke thread rising from the hillside, miles north of any sane man's cabin. That smoke, he swore, was thin but steady, drifting straight up from the snow, like a breath held by something alive. At first no one believed it, not until the widow's eldest boy stumbled into town 3 days later, face blackened from frost, eyes bloodshot, lips cracked like dried mud. He collapsed at the general store, clutching a bundle wrapped in thick wool. It was the newborn, alive, barely crying, but warm. That was when the story began to spread, fast. But back in the weeks before that, when the snow first fell and Lena sealed her sons inside the tunnel with her, none of that mattered. There were no eyes watching, no rumors to chase her name, just the sound of shovels on packed soil, of muffled coughing, of timbers creaking under the weight of survival. The entrance was nothing, a brush-covered hollow in a shallow snowbank near a rocky bluff, one most folks would pass right by. You had to crawl into it, belly to dirt, like an animal. Lena had carved it that way on purpose, low, narrow and curved, so the cold air couldn't rush in. The tunnel angled downward, not just into the earth, but under the root systems of twisted scrub trees, whose gnarled trunks helped brace the ceiling. Her boys called it the snake's throat. But beyond that entry, it opened up. Lena had hollowed a chamber, some 10 feet wide, 6 feet high at the center, with walls shored up by scavenged timbers from the old barn and clay bricks she'd packed and dried herself. It wasn't much, but it was insulated, and it was deep, earth all around. Wind couldn't touch it. She'd dug 2 side nooks for sleeping, one for the boys, one for herself, lined with straw and wool and sewn together scraps. At the center, a low fire pit vented by that narrow shaft up through the hill. She burned peat she'd stored up in summer, slow burning and low smoke, and she lit the place with stubby tallow candles when she could spare them. The heat was minimal, but it didn't escape, and when the first snowstorm hit, it blanketed the ridge so deep that the vent shaft disappeared for 3 hours. That was when Lena sent her eldest to the surface with a stick tied to a rag, teaching him how to dig upward without panic, how to jab the rag through the snow until light and smoke could once again trade places. Her youngest cried at night. She held him close. By day, she taught the boys to ration, to mend the torn blankets with sinew thread, to cook soup from dried beans and salt pork melted with snow. There were no windows, no clock, just the slow drift of heat, the smell of damp wool, and the sound of their own breathing, and the dread, the gnawing doubt she never spoke aloud, that the walls might collapse, that the vent might freeze, that the fire would die and not spark again, that she'd miscalculated and built a tomb. When the freeze deepened, when wind howled like demons across the surface, and frost pushed 6 inches thick into every cabin wall from here to the range, Lena's little burrow stayed just above freezing, 34 degrees, maybe 35. But inside that womb of earth, her newborn stayed alive. No one knew. The other settlers were busy fighting their own terrors. Timber frame homes began to crack at the corners. Horses froze in barns. Old men died in outhouses, pants down, skin blue. Water barrels split from pressure. The Smith family lost their youngest daughter when a pipe burst and sprayed ice across her bed before dawn. And those with hearths were burning books, chairs, anything left that would burn. No one was laughing at Lena anymore, but no one was talking either, because they assumed she was gone. Then came the birth, then came the silence. Then 3 days after the child's cry echoed through her little tunnel walls, she stood at the tunnel entrance, watching for sunlight through the brush, and realized something was wrong. Her eldest's lips were too dark, her milk was running thin, the dried meat wouldn't last, and the baby's breathing had a wheeze. So she wrapped him, bundled tight in everything warm they had, pressed a note into her older son's hand, and told him to run to town, told him to crawl out through the snake's throat, through the brush, through the snow, and not stop until he saw smoke from the baker's chimney. She said nothing about herself. When he left, she closed the tunnel behind him with packed snow and straw. She turned back to the fire, nursed the child again, and wept into the dirt. She didn't expect to see her son again, or the town, or anything but the glow of the fire and the faint breath of her baby on her skin. But he made it, and everything changed. They didn't recognize him at first, not until Sarah Finch, the grocer's girl, let out a startled gasp and ran forward to catch him as he collapsed. He'd stumbled through the edge of town like something risen from a grave, his limbs jerking with exhaustion, eyes hollow, lips blackened and peeling. The bundle he carried was swaddled so tightly it seemed more like a wrapped stump of cloth than a baby at all, but the heat still clung to it. Steam, faint and fleeting, curled from within the folds, as if the child had emerged from a hearth. A hush fell across the few who'd gathered outside the general store, the only place that still had a stove running steady, burning chopped floorboards and family heirlooms. The boy couldn't speak, his teeth chattered too violently, but his fingers clung to the bundle with such ferocity no one dared pry them loose. It was old man Rask who finally stepped forward, wiping his hands on the same wool coat he'd worn through 6 winters. He knelt low, one hand braced against the boards, the other hovering near the bundle, not touching it. "Boy," he rasped, voice barely above the wind's howl. "Is that child alive?" The boy gave a single, rigid nod before he collapsed in full. They carried both inside. The store had no real medical supplies, no doctor within reach. The last one had ridden east before the snow came. But Sarah warmed the baby against her chest, and someone boiled snow water for the boy. That was when they found the note. It was a scrap of torn cloth, writing scrawled in charcoal, shaky lines, barely legible. "He can't stay here. No fire left. No milk. Tell them we're not dead. The tunnel holds. Lena." It took half an hour before the implications set in. Lena Wilkes, mad widow, dirt digger, pariah, was alive. Not just alive, but alive in a hole somewhere under the snow, with a newborn, and barely enough to survive. The sheriff was gone. The preacher was sick. The blacksmith's wife had just buried her sister. No one had time for madness, not with coffins being chopped up to fuel stoves. And yet, one by one, heads turned toward the window, toward the northern ridge. The smoke the rider had spoken of, thin as a whisper, was visible now, faint against the iron-grey sky. There was a pause, a silence, and then a quiet voice, barely more than a whisper, from behind the counter. "We can't leave her out there." That was Mary Finch, not Sarah, but her mother, widow herself, and it was her voice that broke the tension. One by one, others nodded. It wasn't about kindness, not fully. It was survival instinct, the same thing that made wolves drag their wounded back to the den. Something primal stirred. They didn't know how far the boy had run. Could have been 5 miles, maybe more, through waist-deep snow. He had no shoes, just wool wraps. His feet were blistered purple. But someone remembered the ridge, the brush-covered hollow, the crazy snake throat the boy had once described when he'd been sent to town the previous fall to fetch nails and lard. "She dug down, didn't she?" one man said, tapping the counter nervously. "Under the hill?" "Yes," Mary said. "Under, deep. Then she might last, if we bring help." And so they planned. They left at dawn the next morning, a group of 4. Not heroes, just those too restless to sit by while a child's cry echoed in their ears. Mary Finch, Carpenter Smith, Daniel Tulliver, the trapper, and young Matthew Brigg, barely 16 but hard enough to carry a spade and walked straight through 50 degrees air. They wrapped their faces in oilcloth and carried no rifles, just blankets, rope, a kettle of broth, and a hope the tunnel hadn't collapsed. The ridge was 3 miles north, but snow made it feel like 30. They trudged in silence, save for Matthew's muttered prayers and the rhythmic hiss of their breath freezing on their coats. By midday, the smoke appeared again, faint, bending sideways in the wind. They climbed the bluff, crawling on all fours toward the place where the snow bulged slightly, like something had been exhaled beneath it. Smith struck first. His boot found a depression and sunk half a foot. "Here," he whispered. Together they dug, not with shovels at first. Those came later. First they cleared with gloved hands, brushing the packed snow aside until the brush layer appeared, woven with pine needles and dry grass, the camouflage Lena had placed over her tunnel. Underneath it, a soft hollow, a breath of warmth. Mary reached in. "Lena!" she called, not too loud, voice shaking. "It's Mary Finch, from town. Your boy made it." No answer. She crawled in part way, body wriggling through the narrow tunnel mouth, breath catching from the close air. She went another foot, then stopped. It was warm. Not hot, but warm, earth-cling and wool and fire and breath. The air smelled of smoke and sweat and old leather. She called again, louder. "Lena!" Then came the reply, so faint it could have been wind. "Don't bring the cold in." Mary stifled a sob. "We're not," she whispered. "We're here to help." The others crawled in after her, bringing blankets and broth, crawling through that twisting dirt throat until it opened into the chamber. And there she was, Lena Wilkes, hunched over a smoldering peat fire, hair limp with sweat, eyes bloodshot, baby clutched to her chest, both her arms trembling. "You shouldn't have come," she said, voice hoarse. Mary dropped beside her, wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, and set the broth beside the fire. "We had to," she said. "Your boy made it. He saved his brother. And now we're here to save you." Lena shook her head. "There's nothing to save." But that wasn't true. The baby was alive. Her older son, still missing a boot, was alive. Lena, though thin and ghost-pale, still had the strength to argue. The fire still smoldered. The tunnel still stood. They stayed the night in the chamber, rotating watches, feeding the fire with dried peat bricks. Mary held the baby while Lena slept. Smith worked to reinforce one of the tunnel braces with spare timber he'd dragged in. Matthew, quiet and grim, sat near the vent, keeping it clear. At dawn, they began the exodus. It took hours to prepare her. Lena couldn't walk unaided. The baby needed to be wrapped tight. They tied rope through the tunnel and used it to guide their way out, one by one, emerging into a sky so pale and white it hurt the eyes. The wind had picked up again, 60 degrees, maybe colder. They formed a human chain, Smith in front, Matthew behind, Lena and the baby in the middle, Mary and Daniel flanking. The snow sucked at their legs, ice crusted their brows, but they moved. Halfway down the ridge, the storm turned fierce. Visibility dropped. Smith nearly lost the path. Lena staggered. The baby cried, then fell silent. That silence terrified them all, but they pressed forward. By dusk, they saw the first curl of smoke from town. Someone had lit a signal fire on the water tower, hoping to guide them in. The church bell rang. Not for morning, for hope. They arrived just before dark, looking like shadows, hunched, frostbitten, soaked in sweat and snowmelt. People emerged from their homes, dozens, faces filled with disbelief. No one said a word, until the baby cried again, stronger this time. That broke the silence. People rushed forward, blankets, hot tea, tears, laughter. It was surreal. A woman once considered lost, forgotten beneath the snow, had returned, carrying life in her arms, and proof that the unthinkable could be done. She had built a home in the earth, a real one, a warm one, and it had held. No one knew what to say to her, not really. After the cries died down and the excitement thinned, Lena sat in the town's old chapel, shoulders still hunched like she expected the tunnel ceiling to come down on her at any second. The baby was pressed against her chest, wrapped in so many layers of wool and flannel and stitched rags that only a tiny red face peeked through, eyes barely open. Her older boy sat cross-legged at her feet, arms wrapped around his legs, watching the townsfolk drift around the edges of the chapel, like they didn't quite know if she was a ghost, a madwoman, or a prophet. She looked at no one. She spoke little. Her face had lost the color of blood and heat, and the lines around her mouth were drawn like a chisel had carved them there. When the blacksmith's wife brought her broth, she thanked her without lifting her eyes. When the preacher came to ask if she'd built the tunnel out of inspiration or despair, she didn't answer at all. Only Mary Finch sat beside her and didn't say much either. She just kept the fire going and checked the baby's breathing every so often. Outside, the wind still wailed, shoving snow into corners and against doors, driving the temperature back down to lethal levels. "She really did it," someone whispered from the pews. "She stayed underground nearly a month. She had the baby in there, No one's made it this long without help, not even the Kendricks. They lost their chimney, and the baby last week. She dug into the dirt. She made it hold heat like a stove. Whispers like that flowed all around her. Speculation, reverence, fear. It wasn't just survival. It was something that cut deeper, something unspoken, primal, the kind of thing people didn't know how to place. The idea that a woman, not a trapper, not a gunman, not even a man, had done something they hadn't dared. But what shook them even more was that it had worked. In the following days, townsfolk came by to ask her how, not in droves, just ones and twos, always cautiously. They asked about the tunnel, about how deep it went, how she sealed the vent, what she burned, how she kept the fire alive when the cold clawed at the vent shaft, and the snow tried to crush her from above. Lena told them only what she had to. I dug under the root line, she said once. The trees helped brace it. I packed the walls with clay and old barn timbers, burned peat, caught meltwater with a tarp bowl and a trickle vent, slept on straw close to the fire, with blankets hung like a second wall around us. Was it warm? No, but it was never dead cold, and that's all that mattered. But even when she spoke, there was no pride in her voice, no triumph, just a flatness, the voice of someone who did what had to be done and lost something inside doing it. It all was the children that brought the town fully around. The older boy, Elijah, they learned, began to recover slowly. He walked more each day, helped Mary sweep the chapel floors. He flinched when doors slammed. He stared too long at candles. But he was alive. The baby, small as a loaf of bread, made it too. A girl. Lena hadn't named her yet, not out loud, as if she was still waiting to see if the world would take her after all. When the cold lightened, just a little, two men from town, Daniel Tulliver and another farmer named Clay, asked Lena to show them the tunnel, just to see it, just to understand how she'd done it. She refused at first, not from secrecy, but because she didn't want to go back. There's nothing for me there, she said quietly. But Elijah tugged at her coat. Mama, we forgot the skillet. That made her smile for the first time. So, 3 days later, they went. She walked without a coat, just a thick shawl wrapped around her like a shell. Elijah held her hand the whole way. Tulliver and Clay trailed behind, pulling a sled in case her legs gave out. The snow was high still, crusted at the top with a sheen of ice, and the wind hadn't stopped moaning. But the sky was clear for once, wide and blue and unfeeling. It took them 4 hours to reach the ridge. The vent pipe was still visible, barely, a stub of hollow cane poking from the white hill like a snapped reed. When they found the brush-covered entrance, the snow had crusted over it again. Elijah knelt and started brushing it clear with his bare hands, and Lena stood over him, her shadow long against the snow. Let it be, she said gently. I'll go first. She knelt slowly. Her body moved like something much older than it was. Her fingers scraped at the brush, then at the frozen earth, then found the opening, the snake's throat, and slid forward into the dark like she'd never left it. The others waited. For several long minutes, there was silence. Then a muffled voice called back. It's still standing. One by one, they followed. Inside, the tunnel smelled of smoke and earth and time. The fire pit was cold, but the chamber hadn't caved. The walls still stood. The timbers still held. The sleeping nooks looked like they'd only just been vacated. The half-burned peat in the fire pit lay in a circle of ash. A pot still hung on its frame. Lena stood in the center, her hand resting on the packed dirt wall, her face unreadable. I thought it would feel smaller, she said. It's a miracle, Clay muttered, crouching near the fire pit. It's damn near an oven. It never went above 40, she said, but it held. Back in town, news spread fast. She'd gone back in. The tunnel was real. It hadn't collapsed. It had worked, and that changed something. Within a week, 3 more settlers had begun digging. Not full homes, not yet, but side shelters, backup chambers, storage nooks beneath their barns. They came to Lena for advice, bringing gifts they couldn't spare, jars of honey, bolts of wool, a brace of rabbits. She refused most of them, accepted only the wool, which she used to line the cradle Mary gave her for the baby. When the cold dipped again in February, it hit 68 degrees for a single night. The new shelters weren't finished. 2 families fled into the town chapel, sleeping near the pews where Lena still made her cot. That night, someone knocked on the chapel door just before dawn, not for prayer, for guidance. It was the Kendricks. Their hearth had gone cold. The baby hadn't made it. They were shaking with grief, with frost, with shame. They looked at Lena like she was made of something harder than iron. We should have listened, the wife whispered. We thought you'd gone mad. I had, Lena said, but I still knew how to dig. The next morning, she drew them a diagram, crude, just lines scratched into the chapel floor with a bit of charcoal. She showed them how to angle the entry, how to build the choke point so warm air stayed trapped, how to dig down past the frost line, how to brace the ceiling with branches and earth, how to angle the vent shaft so it didn't pull all the heat up and out. By March, the tunnel was being called something else, the root cellar. People joked that Lena had built the world's first underground parlor, but behind the jokes was quiet respect. Because in a valley where entire families had frozen with their coats on, one woman had survived a month buried in dirt, with 2 boys and a fire smaller than a loaf of bread. She never asked for recognition. She never spoke in town meetings. But when others dug, she walked the perimeter and told them, in her flat and gentle voice, what they'd done wrong. That vent's too wide. Don't use pine. It warps when damp. You need 2 exits, in case the snow seals one shut. She never said, "You might die otherwise." She didn't have to. It was understood. The baby grew slowly. Her cries were sharp and healthy. She didn't like the light much at first. Lena said she'd gotten used to the dark of the tunnel. Mary called her Clara. Lena didn't correct her. By April, the thaw began. The snow crust split. Water ran in streams down the hills. Trees sighed as the wind softened. The town counted their losses. 9 dead, 2 houses burned when stoves cracked. 1 woman gone mad, the rest alive, but changed. Lena never went back to the tunnel again, but she didn't abandon it either. She let Elijah dig a trench around the entry to drain meltwater. She let Mary plant herbs near the vent pipe, and when the schoolteacher asked if the town could use the design to build a proper earth shelter for next winter, Lena nodded once. "It's not mine," she said. "It's the earth's." And when the preacher finally asked her if she'd survived through faith or stubbornness, she gave her first real answer. "Neither. I survived because I couldn't let the cold take my children." By summer, everything green had come back in full. The valley stretched in brilliant waves of grass and budding trees. What once was death-white land, where wind had buried horses and frozen breath mid-air, now hummed with bees and clear streams and fields turned over for planting. But nothing was like it had been. Not the people, not the homes, not even the sky, which somehow felt wider, heavier, like it remembered what it had done. And the tunnel was still there. They never tore it down. Some thought Lena would want it filled in, as if sealing it would seal the memory of what happened underground, but she didn't. She never touched it, never moved the branches from the entrance, never stripped the clay walls bare or took back the timbers she'd dragged one by one from the burned-out barn. She let it remain as it was, as if to say, the earth remembers, even if people don't. In early June, the town voted to build a new structure, a community root cellar they called it, but everyone knew it wasn't for vegetables. It was to be buried deeper than any before, lined with stone and clay and timber, just like Lena had done. It would have a fire pit, a narrow entry choke, and multiple escape shafts. Not a copy of her tunnel, but something that owed its bones to her stubbornness. They asked her to help design it. She declined. "You don't need me," she said. "You already lived through it. You know now." Still, she came to watch. She stood near the ridge while young men dug through the dirt, arguing over slope and bracing angles. She didn't speak unless asked directly, and even then she only gave short, quiet answers. Not because she was trying to be mysterious, but because the silence had never left her. Not really. You don't come out of the ground the same as you went in. Elijah didn't speak of the tunnel either. Not much. When asked, he simply said it was warm enough. But once, when another boy at the schoolhouse bragged about helping his father dig a storm shelter, Elijah spoke for the first time in weeks. "You don't know what it's like," he said. "You've never heard snow pressing on the roof like 1,000 footsteps. You've never watched the fire shrink and wondered if your sister would die before sunrise." He said it without venom, without drama, just truth, and no one laughed after that. The baby, Clara, though Lena still wouldn't call her that aloud, grew strong. She took to walking early, steady on her feet before her second winter came. She had dark hair and deep-set eyes that never stayed in one place for long. Mary often said she had the look of someone who'd already seen too much. And maybe she had. By late summer, when the heat baked the dust into the planks of the chapel floor, Lena began helping in town again, not out of obligation, but necessity. The year had burned through stores, too many supplies used to fight off the cold, too little planted. Several families were short on meat, short on flour. Lena, with no husband and only a patch of field left behind the chapel, did what she could. She worked the fields by hand. She mended boots. She boiled wool and re-spun it into rough blankets. And when Mary caught a fever in August, Lena took in her daughter Sarah without asking. That was how people began to see her differently, not just as the woman who survived, but the one who showed up, the one who said nothing when someone's roof leaked but walked up the next day with pitch and cloth, the one who brought food to a widow with a newborn and stayed outside in the cold, coatless, until she was sure they'd taken it. Still, no one got close, not like before. She was present, but apart, until one night, just after the first frost of the second year, A man named Roy Barrett came through town. He was a hauler, mule-train man who carried salt and barley and long iron nails down from the north. Big, red-faced, with eyes that moved fast, the type who drank hard and smiled too wide. He made the mistake of laughing at the buried lady. By the third year, no one called it a miracle anymore. What Lena had done wasn't something divine or incomprehensible. It was survival carved in dirt, proof that sheer resolve, wielded without pride, could reshape death into life. Across the valley and far beyond, as news spread like wind through broken shingles, the image of that tunnel, the woman, the fire, the baby kept alive in the womb of earth, transformed from tale into blueprint. Families who'd never met her began building with spades instead of saws, cutting sideways into slopes, lining walls with packed clay, weaving straw mats to hang like curtains inside dirt chambers. "Do it like the widow" became something whispered from mother to son when the wind rattled window panes in the dark. Not everyone knew her name, but they knew what she did, and it kept spreading. The town never gave her a statue. That wasn't how they honored things. But the old ridge where her tunnel sat was quietly marked with a small post of iron and oak. No words, just a carved symbol, an open hand cradling a flame. People knew what it meant. Lena rarely went out past the chapel anymore. Her knees had started to swell, and her right shoulder clicked every time she lifted her arm. Elijah did most of the lifting now. He'd grown tall, with Lena's silent watchfulness and his father's steady eyes. By his 12th birthday, he'd rebuilt the back wall of their cabin with nothing but salvaged stone and mud mortar. Mary Finch said he had hands like a stonemason, but a soul that moved like a tree, quiet, still, rooted. Clara was nearly 3 and had learned to speak late, but when she did, her words came in full sentences, sharp and strange. "I remember the dark," she said once. Elijah looked at her in disbelief. "You were just born," Clara shrugged. "But I remember." Lena said nothing. She had her own memories. None of them were gentle. There were nights she still woke gasping, hand reaching instinctively for a wall that was no longer there, expecting the close, damp heat of the tunnel, the weight of snow above her, the flicker of dying firelight. Her heart would hammer, her breath fog the air, and for a few seconds, she would be right back in that cave, hearing the baby's shallow breathing, the scrape of frost falling down the vent shaft, the stillness between her children's heartbeat and death. But then the wind would rattle the cabin window, and she'd feel the softness of cloth, not earth, under her palms. She'd exhale slowly and rise to bank the fire. Survival leaves its print. In July of that year, something happened that no one could have expected. A family from Clear Valley, 30 miles east, arrived at Lena's doorstep. Their wagon was falling apart. Their boy had frostbite on both feet from a storm the previous spring, and their mother carried a sheaf of rolled canvas under one arm. "We followed your designs," the father said, pulling off his hat. "It saved us. We were trapped 6 days. Our chimney cracked, and the barn caught fire. We were about to start burning the table legs when I remembered what the trader said about the woman who buried herself and came out with a child." Lena didn't answer. She just looked down at the boy's feet, purple and puckered, and nodded once. The mother unrolled the canvas. It was their drawing, a near-perfect reproduction of Lena's original shelter, but they'd added to it notes on water runoff, a vent chimney cap made of salvaged tin, a drying rack above the fire pit. They were improvements, smart ones. "We're not here to ask," the mother said. "We're here to give it back, what we learned." Lena didn't cry. She never did. But she took the drawing in both hands and folded it slowly, carefully, like something sacred. Then she passed it to Elijah without speaking. That fall, Elijah began keeping a book, just a ledger at first. Names, places, measurements, then ideas, experiments, sketches. He copied Lena's diagrams, then added new ones. What worked, what failed, why some shelters collapsed, why others stayed warm longer. He asked the old men about bracing. He asked the wives about cloth layering. He watched wind patterns and mapped snow lines along the ridge. By winter, that book had 50 pages. He never called it his. He just wrote "From the Ridge" on the inside cover. Others began contributing. Trappers, miners, a school teacher from 2 towns over. Even Mary Finch, whose diagrams of the chimney vent became the standard across 3 counties. It became something like a shared gospel, passed hand to hand, duplicated slowly by candlelight. Lena never wrote in it, but Elijah said every page came from her. That winter was the worst since the one that nearly killed her. 71 in early February, the kind of cold that cracked axe handles and turned breath into frost mid-sentence. Entire towns were snowed in for days. 4 fires burned through cabin roofs from overstoked stoves. 2 families perished in the east, but in their valley, none. Every household now had either a full root chamber or a tunnel dug beneath their barn. Fire deaths dropped. Hypothermia cases fell to almost nothing. The tunnels had changed everything, not just survival, but how people thought of heat, of shelter, of the very land under their feet. For generations, they'd built upwards to fight cold. Now, they learned to go down, into the ground, into the stillness, all because a widow had refused to build a cabin the way a man told her to. By spring, Lena's legs had gone too stiff to walk without a cane. She spent her days by the hearth, wrapped in thick wool, Clara playing at her feet. Elijah made her a stool carved from a single log, sanded smooth until it gleamed. She didn't say thank you. She didn't need to. He understood. That summer, something else changed. The governor's surveyors came through, charting the land, recording settlements. They asked about the strange bump near the ridge with a smoke vent. Someone told them it was the widow's tunnel. The men laughed. Then they stopped laughing when they were told what had happened there. They asked to see it. Lena didn't let them. "It's not a museum," she said. "It's a grave I didn't die in." But Elijah took them up there anyway. 2 days later, when she wasn't watching, he showed them the slope, the bracing, the chimney system. They took notes, sketched, said it might be useful in other places. That fall, a government letter arrived. It offered money, recognition, her name on something. Lena burned it. "I didn't do it to be remembered," she said. Still, she sat a little straighter for a few days. Not proud, just clear-eyed. By the 4th winter, a child was born in the community root shelter during a storm. The parents named her Lena. They didn't ask permission, no one needed to. Elijah continued the book. Others began copying it. By the time he turned 18, it had grown into 3 ledgers and a folio of hand-drawn templates. That spring, just after the melt, Lena passed quietly in her sleep. No drama, no illness. She simply didn't wake. Clara found her that morning, still sitting up, one hand resting on the hearthstone, eyes closed like she was listening for the fire to crackle again. The town held a service. People came from valleys Lena had never visited. People who had never seen her face but had lived because of what she did. They brought drawings, letters. A child carried a miniature tunnel made of carved birchwood with real bracing inside. Another family brought a peat brick wrapped in ribbon. They buried her near the ridge, not inside the tunnel, but above it, just close enough so the wind would still sound the way it had in that first terrible winter. Her headstone was plain, but Elijah carved the same symbol that had once marked the ridge post, an open hand, cradling a flame. He added one more line beneath it, carved so deep it could be read with fingers if the snow ever came that high again. She went into the earth to save her children and came out carrying fire. And when the cold came back, because it always did, those who survived would look to the ridge, to the earth, to the fire hidden beneath, and remember, sometimes madness is just survival ahead of its time.